I think the idea I would have is to be a bit more rigorous in trying to measure the amount of love you add or subtract from the world in second, third, fourth, fifth order effects. It's actually, I think, especially in the world of tech, quite doable. You know, you just might not like, the shareholders may not like that kind of metric, but it's pretty easy to measure. Like, that's not even, I'm perhaps half joking about love, but we could talk about just happiness and well being, long term well being. It's pretty easy for Facebook, for YouTube, for all these companies to measure that. They do a lot of kinds of surveys. They could do. I mean, there's very simple solutions here that you could just survey how. I mean, surveys are in some sense useless because they're a subset of the population. You're just trying to get a sense. It's very loose kind of understanding, but integrated deeply as part of the technology. Most of our tech is recommender systems. Most of the sorry, not tech. Online interaction is driven by recommender systems that learn very little data about you and use that data mostly based on traces of your previous behavior to suggest future things. This is how Twitter, this is how Facebook works. This is how AdSense for Google AdSense works. This is how Netflix, YouTube work, and so on. And for them to just track as opposed to engagement, how much you spend in a particular video, a particular site, is also give you the technology to do self-report of what makes you feel good, of what makes you grow as a person, of what makes you, the best version of yourself. The Rogan idea of the hero of your own movie, and just add that little bit of information. If you have people, you have this like happiness surveys of how you feel about the last 5 days. How would you report your experience? You can lay out the set of videos. It's kind of fascinating to watch. I don't know if you ever look at YouTube, the history of videos you've looked at. It's fascinating. It's very embarrassing for me. Like, it'll be like a lecture and then like a set of videos that I don't want anyone to know about, which will be like, I don't know, maybe like 5 videos in a row where it looks like I watched the whole thing, which I probably did, about like how to cook a steak, even though, or just like the best chefs in the world cooking steaks, and I'm just like sitting there watching it for no purpose whatsoever, wasting away my life, or like funny cat videos, or like legit. That's always a good one, and I could look back and rate which videos made me a better person and not. And I mean, on a more serious note, there's a bunch of conversations, podcasts, or lectures I've watched which made me a better person, and some that made me a worse person. Quite honestly, and not for stupid reasons like I feel dumber, but because I do have a sense that started me on a path of not being kind to other people. For example, I'll give you for my own, and I'm sorry for ranting, but maybe there's some usefulness to this kind of exploration of self. When I focus on creating, on programming, on science, I become a much deeper thinker and a kinder person to others. When I listen to too many, a little bit is good, but too many podcasts or videos about how our world is melting down, or criticizing ridiculous people, the worst of the quote unquote woke, for example. There's all these groups that are misbehaving in fascinating ways because they've been corrupted by power. The more I watch criticism of them, the worse I become. And I'm aware of this, but I'm also aware that for some reason it's pleasant to watch those sometimes. And so for me to be able to self-report that to the YouTube algorithm, to the systems around me, and they ultimately try to optimize to make me the best the best version of myself, which I personally believe would make YouTube a lot more money because I'd be much more willing to spend time on YouTube and give YouTube a lot more of my money. That's great for business and great for humanity because it'll make me a kinder person. It'll increase the love quotient, the love metric, and It'll make them a lot of money. I feel like everything is aligned. And so you should do that, not just for YouTube algorithm, but also for military strategy and whether to go to war or not. Because one externality you can think of about going to war, which I think we talked about offline, is we often go to war with kind of governments, with not with the people. You have to think about the kids of countries that see a soldier, and because of what they experience, their interaction with the soldier, hate is born. When you're like 8 years old, 6 years old, you lose your dad, you lose your mom, you lose a friend, somebody close to you. That one really powerful externality that could be reduced to love, positive and negative, is the hate that's born when you make decisions, and that's going to take fruition. That little seed is going to become a tree that then leads to the kind of destruction that we talk about. But in my sense, it's possible to reduce everything to a measure of how much love does this add to the world. All that to say, do you have ideas of how we practically build systems that create a resilient society?
There were a lot of good things that you shared where there's like 15 different ways that we could enter this that are all interesting. So I'm trying to see which one will probably be most useful.
Pick the one or two things that are least ridiculous.
When you were mentioning if we could see some of the second order effects or externalities that we aren't used to seeing, specifically the one of a kid being radicalized somewhere else, which engenders enmity in them towards us, which decreases our own future security. Yeah. Even if you don't care about the kid. If you care about the kid, it's a whole other thing. I mean, I think when we saw this, when Jane Fonda and others went to Vietnam and took photos and videos of what was happening, and you got to see the pictures of the kids with napalm on them, that like the anti-war effort was bolstered by that in a way it couldn't have been without that. There's until we can see the images, you can't have a mirror neuron effect in the same way. And when you can, that starts to have a powerful effect. I think there's a deep principle that you're sharing there, which is that if we can have a rivalrous intent where our in-group, whatever it is, maybe it's our political party wanting to win within the U.S., maybe it's our nation state wanting to win in a war or an economic war over resource or whatever it is, that if we don't obliterate the other people completely, they don't go away. They're not engendered to like us more. They didn't become less smart. So they have more enmity towards us, and whatever technologies we employed to be successful, they will now reverse engineer, make iterations on, and come back. And so you drive an arms race, which is why you can see that the wars were over history employing more lethal weaponry. And not just the kinetic war, the information war and the narrative war and the economic war, right? Like it just increased capacity in all of those fronts. And so what seems like a win to us on the short term might actually really produce losses in the long term. And what's even in our own best interest in the long term is probably more aligned with everyone else because we interaffect each other. And I think the thing about globalization and exponential tech and the rate at which we affect each other and the rate at which we affect the biosphere that we're all affected by is that this kind of proverbial spiritual idea that we're all interconnected and need to think about that in some way, that was easy for tribes to get because everyone in the tribe so clearly saw their interconnection and dependence on each other. But in terms of a global level, the speed at which we are actually interconnected, the speed at which the harm happening to something in Wuhan affects the rest of the world, or a new technology developed somewhere affects the entire world, or an environmental issue or whatever, is making it to where we either actually all get, not as a spiritual idea, just even as physics, right? We all get the interconnectedness of everything, and that we either all consider that and see how to make it through more effectively together, or failures anywhere end up becoming decreased quality of life and failures and increased risk everywhere.
Don't you think people are beginning to experience that at the individual level? So governments are resisting it they're trying to make us not empathize with each other, feel connected. But don't you think people are beginning to feel more and more connected? Like, isn't that exactly what the technology is enabling? Like social networks, we tend to criticize them, but isn't there a sense which we're experiencing,
When you watch those videos that are criticizing whether it's the woke Antifa side or the QAnon Trump supporter side, does it seem like they have increased empathy for people that are outside of their ideologic
no,
camp?
not at all. So I may be conflating my own experience of the world and that of the populace. I tend to see those videos as feeding something that's a relic of the past. They figured out that drama fuels clicks, but whether I'm right or wrong, I don't know. But I tend to sense that is not, that hunger for drama is not fundamental to human beings. That we want to actually, that we want to understand Antifa, and we want to like empathize. We want to take radical ideas and be able to empathize with them
Well,
and synthesize it all.
okay, let's look at cultural outliers in terms of violence versus compassion. We can see that a lot of cultures have relatively lower in-group violence, bigger out-group violence, and there's some variance in them and variance at different times based on the scarcity or abundance of resource and other things. But you can look at, say, Jains, whose whole religion is around nonviolence, so much so that they don't even hurt plants. They only take fruits that fall off them and stuff. Or to go to a larger population, you take Buddhists, where for the most part, with a few exceptions, for the most part, across 3 millennia and across lots of different countries and geographies and whatever, you have 10 million people plus or minus who don't hurt bugs. The whole spectrum of genetic variance that is happening within a culture of that many people, and head traumas and whatever, and nobody hurts bugs. And then you look at a group where the kids grow up as child soldiers in Liberia or Darfur, where to make it to adulthood, pretty much everybody's killed people hand to hand, and killed people who were civilian or innocent type of people. And you say, okay, so we were very neotenous. We can be conditioned by our environment, and humans can be conditioned where almost all the humans show up in these two different bell curves. It doesn't mean that the Buddhists had no violence. It doesn't mean that these people had no compassion, but they're very different Gaussian distributions. And so I think one of the important things that I like to do is look at the examples of the populations, what Buddhism shows regarding compassion, or what Judaism shows around education, the average level of education that everybody gets because of a culture that is really working on conditioning it, or various cultures. What are the positive deviants outside of the statistical deviance to see what is actually possible? And then say, what are the conditioning factors? And can we condition those across a few of them simultaneously? And could we build a civilization like that? Becomes a very interesting question. So there's this kind of realpolitik idea that humans are violent. Large groups of humans become violent. They become irrational. Specifically those two things, rivalrous and violent and irrational. And so in order to minimize the total amount of violence and have some good decisions, they need ruled somehow. And that not getting that is some kind of naive utopianism that doesn't understand human nature yet. This gets back to like mimesis of desire as an inexorable thing. I think the idea of the masses is actually a kind of propaganda that is useful for the classes that control, to popularize the idea that most people are too violent, lazy, undisciplined, and irrational to make good choices, and therefore their choices should be sublimated in some kind of way. I think that if we look back at these conditioning environments, we can say, okay, so the kids that go to a really fancy school and have a good developmental environment like Exeter Academy, there's still a Gaussian distribution of how well they do on any particular metric, but on average, they become senators. and the worst ones become high-end lawyers or whatever. And then I look at an inner city school with a totally different set of things, and I see a very, very differently displaced Gaussian distribution, but a very different set of conditioning factors. So then I say the masses. Well, if all those kids who were one of the parts of the masses got to go to Exeter and have that family and whatever, would they still be the masses? Could we actually condition more social virtue, more civic virtue, more orientation towards dialectical synthesis, more empathy, more rationality widely? Yes. Would that lead to better capacity for something like participatory governance, democracy or republic, or some kind of participatory governance?
Yes.
Yes. Is it necessary for it, actually? Yes. And is it good for class interests? No, not really.
By the way, when you say class interest, this is the powerful leading over the less powerful, that kind of idea.
Anyone that benefits from asymmetries of power doesn't necessarily benefit from decreasing those asymmetries of power and kind of increasing the capacity of people more widely. And so when we talk about power, we're talking about asymmetries in agency, influence, and control.
You think that hunger for power is fundamental to human nature? I think we should get that straight before we talk about other stuff. So like this pickup line that I use at a bar often, which is power corrupts and absolute power corrupts, absolutely. Is that true, or is that just a fancy thing to say? In modern society, there's something to be said. Have we changed as societies over time in terms of how much we crave power?
That there is an impulse towards power that is innate in people and can be conditioned one way or the other, yes. But you can see that Buddhist society does a very different thing with it at scale. That you don't end up seeing the emergence of the same types of sociopathic behavior, and particularly then creating sociopathic institutions. And so it's like, is eating the foods that were rare in our evolutionary environment that give us more dopamine hit because they were rare and they're not anymore, salt, fat, sugar, is there something pleasurable about those where humans have an orientation to overeat if they can? Well, the fact that there is that possibility doesn't mean everyone will obligately be obese and die of obesity, right? Like, it's possible to have a particular impulse and to be able to understand it, have other ones and be able to balance them. And so to say that power dynamics are obligate in humans and we can't do anything about it is very similar to me to saying like everyone is going to be obligately obese.
Yeah, so there's some degree to which the control of those impulses has to do with the conditioning early in life.
Yes, and the culture that creates the environment to be able to do that, and then the recursion on that.
Okay, so what if we were to just bear with me, just asking for a friend, if we were to kill all humans on Earth and then start over, is there ideas about how to build up? Okay, we don't have to kill it. Let's leave the humans on Earth. They're fine. And go to Mars and start a new society. Is there ways to construct systems of conditioning, education, of how we live with each other that would incentivize us properly to not seek power, to not construct systems that are of asymmetry of power, and to create systems that are resilient to all kinds of terrorist attacks, to all kinds of destructions?
I believe so.
So is there some inklings we get? Of course, you probably don't have all the answers, but you have insights about what that looks like. I mean, Is it just rigorous practice of dialectic synthesis as essentially conversations with assholes of various flavors until they're not assholes anymore because you've become deeply empathetic with their experience?
Okay, so there's a lot of things that we would need to construct to come back to this. Like, what is the basis of rivalry? How do you bind it? How does it relate to tech? If you have a culture that is doing less rivalry, does it always lose in war to those who do war better? And how do you make something on the enactment of how to get there from here?
Great. So what's rivalry? Why is rivalry bad or good? Is another word for rivalry competition?
Yes, I think roughly yes. I think bad and good are kind of silly concepts here. Good for some things, bad for other things,
For
good in some
resilience.
contexts and others. Even that.
Okay.
Let me give you an example that relates back to the Facebook measuring thing you were mentioning a moment ago. First, I think what you're saying is actually aligned with the right direction and what I want to get to in a moment. But it's not, the devil is in the details here. So
I enjoy praise. It feeds my ego. I grow stronger. So I appreciate that.
I will make sure to include one piece every 15 minutes as we
Thank
go.
you.
So it's easier to measure. There are problems with this argument, but there's also utility to it. So let's take it for the utility it has first. It's harder to measure happiness than it is to measure comfort. We can measure with technology that the shocks in a car are making the car bounce less, that the bed is softer, and material science and those types of things. And happiness is actually hard for philosophers to define, because some people find that there's certain kinds of overcoming suffering that are necessary for happiness. There's happiness that feels more like contentment, and happiness that feels more like passion. Is passion the source of all suffering or the source of all creativity? There's deep stuff, and it's mostly first person, not measurable third person stuff, even if maybe it corresponds to third person stuff to some degree. But we also see examples of, some of our favorite examples is people who are in the worst environments who end up finding happiness, right? Where the third person stuff looks to be less conducive, and there's some Viktor Frankl, Nelson Mandela, whatever. But it's pretty easy to measure comfort, and it's pretty universal. And I think we can see that the Industrial Revolution started to replace happiness with comfort quite heavily as the thing it was optimizing for. And we can see that when increased comfort is given, maybe because of the evolutionary disposition that expending extra calories, when for the majority of our history we didn't have extra calories, was not a safe thing to do. Who knows why? When extra comfort is given, it's very easy to take that path, even if it's not the path that supports overall well-being long-term. And so we can see that, when you look at the techno-optimist idea that we have better lives than Egyptian pharaohs and kings and whatever, what they're largely looking at is how comfortable our beds are and how comfortable the transportation systems are and things like that, in which case there's massive improvement. But we also see that in some of the nations where people have access to the most comfort, suicide and mental illness are the highest. And we also see that some of the happiest cultures are actually some of the ones that are in materially lame environments. And so there's a very interesting question here. And if I understand correctly, you do cold showers. And Joe Rogan was talking about how he needs to do some fairly intensive kind of struggle that is a non-comfort to actually induce being better as a person. This concept of hormesis, that it's actually stressing an adaptive system that increases its adaptive capacity, and that there's something that the happiness of a system has something to do with its adaptive capacity, its overall resilience, health, well-being, which requires a decent bit of discomfort. And yet in the presence of the comfort solution, it's very hard to not choose it. And then as you're choosing it regularly, to actually down-regulate your overall adaptive capacity. And so when we start saying, can we make tech where we're measuring for the things that it produces beyond just the measure of GDP or whatever particular measures look like the revenue generation or profit generation of my business, are all the meaningful things measurable? And what are the right measures? And what are the externalities of optimizing for that measurement set? What meaningful things aren't included in that measurement set that might have their own externalities? These are some of the questions we actually have to take seriously.
Yeah. And I think they're answerable questions, right?
Progressively better, not perfect.
Right. So first of all, let me throw out happiness and comfort out of the discussion. Those seem like useless. The distinction. Because I said they're useful. Well-being is useful, but I think I take it back. I proposed new metrics in this brainstorm session, which is one is like personal growth, which is intellectual growth. I think we're able to make that concrete for ourselves. Like you're a better person than you were a week ago, or a worse person than you were a week ago. I think we can ourselves report that and understand what that means. It's this gray area, and we try to define it. But I think we humans are pretty good at that because we have a sense, an idealistic sense of the person we might be able to become. We all dream of becoming a certain kind of person, and I think we have a sense of getting closer and not towards that person. Maybe this is not a great metric. Fine. The other one is love, actually. Fuck if you're happy or not, or you're comfortable or not. How much love do you have towards your fellow human beings? I feel like if you try to optimize that and increasing that, that's a good metric. How many times a day, sorry, if I can quantify, how many times a day have you thought positively of another human being? Just put that down as a number and increase that number.
I think the process of saying, okay, so let's not take GDP or GDP per capita as the metric we want to optimize for, because GDP goes up during war and it goes up with more healthcare spending from sicker people and various things that we wouldn't say correlate to quality of life. Addiction drives GDP awesomely.
By the way, when I said growth, I wasn't referring to GDP.
I know. I'm giving an example now
Sure.
of the primary metric we use and why it's not an adequate metric, because we're exploring other ones.
Yeah.
So the idea of saying, what would the metrics for a good civilization be? If I had to pick a set of metrics, what would the best ones be if I was going to optimize for those? And then really try to run the thought experiment more deeply and say, okay, so what happens if we optimize for that? Try to think through the first and second and third order effects of what happens that's positive. And then also say, what negative things can happen from optimizing that? What actually matters that is not included in that or in that way of defining it? Because love versus number of positive thoughts per day, I could just make a long list of names and just say positive thing about each one. It's all very superficial. Not include animals or the rest of life, have a very shallow total amount of it, but I'm optimizing the number, and if I get some credit for the number. So and this is when I said the model of reality isn't reality. When you make a set of metrics, say we're going to optimize for this, whatever reality is that is not included in those metrics can be the areas where harm occurs, which is why I would say that wisdom is something like the discernment that leads to right choices beyond what metrics-based optimization would offer.